What's up, y'all? Welcome to another episode of Critical Consciousness. I'm excited about today's episode, and I think it's going to be enlightening and, more important than anything, helpful to those of us who are trying to develop our analysis of power structures. I'm going to be digging through some Epstein files, citing from a variety of sources, and overall, I'm going to be making the connection between the Epstein freaks, right, the pedophiles, the elite class, and the fear of communism. So without further ado, let's get into it. Upon reviewing many of the exchanges that were released as part of the Epstein files, it becomes pretty clear what unites members of the ruling class, aside from, of course, pedophilia. And that is anti-communism. Not only are all of the people involved in the exchanges virulently anti-communist, but they also demonstrate a keen sense of class consciousness and a not-so-secret contempt for the poor. So let's take a look at a few concrete examples. And I think we'd be remiss not to start with Steve Bannon, who has made no secret of his disdain for China and for communism in general. In fact, the destruction of the Chinese Communist Party is pretty much Steve Bannon's life purpose. And there were a whole bunch of quotes that I could have pulled from, but this particular one comes from the American Prospect, in which Bannon says, and I quote, "To me, the economic war with China is everything, and we have to be maniacally focused on that. If we," and by we he means the West, the United States, "if we continue to lose it, we're 5 years away, I think 10 years at the most, of hitting an inflection point from which we'll never be able to recover." Steve Bannon even produced a whole film whose main intention is to disparage the image of Chinese President Xi Jinping. The film is called Claws of the Red Dragon. And as far as the nature of Bannon and Epstein's relationship, well, not only did they regularly exchange emails, but they were also on a text message basis. And here's an interesting one where Bannon and Epstein are discussing China. Epstein says, "Your deplorables need an enemy. China, China, China." To which Bannon replies, "Yes, yes, yes, I am the evangelicalist on this one." In another thread, Bannon is again discussing his favorite topic with Epstein, and here he's referring to China. Quote, "It's a group of peasants trying to run a world economy. G barely has high school education, completely panicked when they read through the deal, already leaking oil." And now moving on to another one of Epstein's anti-communist confidants, Bill Siegel, who authored this book, The Control Factor, in which he argues that the true threat to Western civilization is radical Islam, and that political correctness is the primary obstacle that stops us from fully defeating it. And just as a quick aside, I think that's particularly interesting considering the narratives surrounding the United States war on Iran. Let's take a look at this Hegseth clip to demonstrate what I'm talking about.
No stupid rules of engagement, no nation building quagmire, no democracy building exercise, no politically correct wars. We fight to win, and we don't waste time.
But anyways, I digress. Epstein's assistant Leslie Groff can be seen corresponding with Bill Siegel on numerous occasions. And the most interesting tidbit in this sense is an email thread in which Siegel's theories are being explained. So here it says, quote, "Much as the communists of the Soviet Union had formulated in the 1950s a detailed long-term plan to destroy America, many of the effects of which we are seeing as of late, including destroying the nuclear family, secularizing the nation, feminizing men, these documents identify many strategies to infiltrate while eroding the foundations of our civilization in order to transform it into an Islamic one." And when Siegel sent this, Epstein basically replies with, "Oh, I already read your book, bro. It was awesome. Congratulations." And next, in this exchange, Epstein and his assistant can be seen liaising with USC statistics professor Victoria Stodden, discussing intellectual property. And here Stodden says, quote, "I am about to take on the machine. Well, here's what I mean. I had an interesting meeting with Eben Moglin, Columbia law professor who wrote the GPL version 3, near ubiquitously used open license for code, in which he explained that the goal is ... communism. Step one is using the GPL license designed to obliterate intellectual property in code. Step two is removing intellectual property in computer hardware. And step 3 is removing property rights and bandwidth, i.e., the net neutrality movement. And she concludes the email by saying, I think this is counter to scientific norms that we don't dictate terms of use in our scientific outputs, rather, knowledge is considered a public good. So I'm writing this up in a paper now which the pro-communists will despise. And finally, perhaps the most rabid of the anti-communists that Epstein was in touch with was British historian and TV personality Simon Sebag Montefiore, who, at the time he was writing Epstein in the released emails between 2002 and 2004, was wrapping up his second Stalin hit piece called Stalin, the Court of the Red Tsar. And in the near 1,000-page popular history book, Sebag characterizes the Soviet leadership as one of shameless criminality, Stalin as a monster, and communism as a vile system. Here, Sebag reveals the intimacy of his relations with Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell by saying, Ghislaine, dearest, are you still alive? Hope you're all right. Just back from Eurotour all over Europe with, he's referring to his book Stalin, exhausted but haven't spoken to anyone for ages. Love, Sebag. And while he was writing this book just 1 year earlier, Sebag says, Hi, G-Max, for Ghislaine Maxwell. Would love to see. I'm working frantically and grimly on Stalin and all his terrible deeps up to my elbows in blood. So we see a not so subtle anti-communism there in Sebag's works, and I'm going to speed this up just a little bit, otherwise we're going to be here for a while. So we see that many within Epstein's inner circle were anti-communists, and perhaps this therefore goes without saying, but what were their attitudes toward the poor, or poor people, as they often put it? And there are a couple of exchanges of note in this regard, to put it mildly. In the next example I'm going to show, Epstein is liaising with a one Roger Schank, former AI computer scientist and cognitive psychologist, which is a fairly scary career combination if you ask me. But Schank says to Epstein, about to meet head monk from Rome who is interested in educating poor people. I'm guessing I may have found my guy, to which Epstein replies, educating? And Schank replies, yes, amazingly, poverty does not preclude education, as you should well know from Coney Island. And then there's this next one, which has made the rounds and which has understandably freaked a lot of people out. Film producer Barry Josephson, who has produced such masterpieces as Dirty Grandpa, while expressing his excitement to Epstein in an email exchange, says, cool, I'm excited. Also, I've been thinking a lot about that question you asked Bill Gates. How do we get rid of poor people as a whole? And I have an answer/comment regarding that for you. When can I call you today to discuss this? Now, there are a couple more bizarre and direct references to poor people in the Epstein files, but I'm going to jump to one that I think is most interesting and most telling, particularly as it relates to the class consciousness of the elite class. And in this one, Epstein is exchanging emails with Jess Staley, former CEO of Barclays Bank, and who, at the time the email was written, was being touted as JP Morgan Chase's next CEO. The email was written at the time of the popular uprisings in Sao Paulo, Brazil in 2014. And here Staley says, you want to know why we are not Sao Paulo? Watch TV ads on the Super Bowl. It's all about hip blacks and hip cars with white women. The group that should be in the streets have been bought off by Jay-Z. And whoa, that one is really crazy, in my opinion. Here you have an elite banker, an American capitalist, acknowledging the role that celebrities play in pacifying not just poor people, but black people in the United States. And as a quick aside, both of those banking institutions, JP Morgan Chase and Barclays, have a well-documented connection to the slave trade, having essentially received their startup capital from the distribution, sale, and labor of enslaved Africans. JP Morgan Chase, as well as many other banks, have even apologized for this. And this comes from The Guardian. America's second biggest bank, JP Morgan Chase, has made a rare apology for its subsidiaries' involvement in the slave trade 200 years ago, admitting that it accepted slaves as loan collateral and ended up owning several hundred. The Wall Street heavyweight said parts of the business accepted thousands of slaves as collateral on loans made to plantation owners in the South in the early 19th century. It sent a letter to employees expressing contrition for its involvement in a, quote, brutal and unjust institution. It made the disclosure to comply with a rule requiring companies to detail past dealings with the trade when they are doing business with the city of Chicago. So, anyways, why is this? How do we contextualize this? Why are these politicians, these bankers, authors, film producers, members of the elite class so afraid of communism? And I think a simple, short answer to that question is, well, they're wealthy. Of course, they don't want their wealth to be redistributed and for everyone to be equal, which is what communism essentially espouses, right? And while that answer would certainly encapsulate a certain gist, if you will, it's actually much deeper than that. And you might be surprised to learn about the history of anti communism, how it's been perpetuated by individuals such as these, and how there's a good chance they've even infiltrated your own thinking on the topic. Now, the historical context that I'm going to be providing in this particular video begins at the end of the Second World War. And I want to paint this picture for just a moment, okay? It's 1945. Significant parts of Europe have been destroyed. Infrastructure is in ruins. People are distraught. They've lost loved ones. They've been living in fear. And the working class, the majority of people in society, are fed up with this. Okay, this is the Second World War they've been involved in less than 30 years. And for the most part, people know exactly who's responsible for starting these wars, right? It's the wealthy, the ruling class. And so people all across Europe, all across the world, are yearning for something fundamentally different, a different mode of production. And in this context, we see the rise of these post capitalist experiments throughout Europe, the majority of which flew under the banner of the hammer and sickle, or communism. For example, in 1947, the Italian Communist Party had over 2 million members. In Czechoslovakia, there were 1 million members, and numbers were generally increasing by the hundreds of thousands all across Europe. Even in Great Britain, Communist Party membership tripled after World War II, and this is also the period of time where the Communist Party of the United States, CPUSA, when their membership was at its peak. And I think the way most people living in the United States or in the West in general learn about this history or the rise of communism in Europe after World War II is to say the Soviet Union was infiltrating Europe and sort of brainwashing everyone and forcing everyone to become communists. But I think this narrative really obfuscates the reality and sort of strips people of their intellectual agency and ability to think for themselves. The truth is that communism was becoming popular, yes, in part because of Soviet influence, but also because these communist parties, particularly in Europe, were delivering for the people. They were transforming people's economic and social lives in ways that had never even been imaginable prior to this. And I'm going to cite from a couple of sources here. The first is former CBS and ABC reporter Howard K. Smith, who, by the way, was not a communist himself. And here he's talking about communism in Hungary as a result of the Hungarian Communist Party's 3-year plan between 1947 and 1949. Smith says, quote, the standard of living for the mass of people was higher than it had ever been in Hungarian history, end quote. Also referring to the People's Republic of Hungary, American historian Herbert Aptheker writes, quote, unemployment had vanished. For the first time in Hungarian history, a complete system of socialized medicine was created, and there was provided paid vacations for all workers, really universal education, and important social security benefits, especially for the incapacitated and the aged, end quote. And for the sake of corroboration, English development economist Doreen Warner wrote of the MKP's success, quote, there had been a very marked rise in real wages and a rise in the living standards of the poorest peasants. In economic terms, the revolution was brilliantly successful, end quote. So we see, contrary to this popular narrative of outright Soviet coercion and control, the working classes of Europe were gravitating toward communism because it was changing their lives for the better and offering them previously unforeseen, unheard of opportunities. And as it turns out, when you deliver for the people, they show up and support you in return. So now that we have this picture, right, the fact that communism after World War II is becoming increasingly popular, not just in Europe, but throughout the whole world, we have to study the reaction of the capitalist classes to all of this. And suffice to say, it was an all out blitzkrieg as far as attempting to sabotage these movements, to stop the nationalization of industries, and above all else, to prevent the working people in their own countries from witnessing and feeling inspired by these post capitalist alternatives. Insert the Marshall Plan or the European Recovery Program, a $13 billion US initiative designed to rebuild Europe's war torn infrastructure and revive the continent's economic life. However, the program was hardly a charity, right? And there were serious expectations and contingencies given to the 16 Western European nations who accepted the aid. Chief among them was to help in stopping the spread of communism throughout Europe. Now, what's less known and discussed about the Marshall Plan is the integral role that the CIA played in its development and execution. And right now feels like a good time to give just a bit of context as to the founding of the CIA, which took place just 1 year before the Marshall Plan was created, especially since I think this will help us see the through line between the Epstein files, the ruling class, and anti-communism even more clearly. And the book that I'm going to be referencing in this case is Who Paid the Piper? The CIA and the Cultural Cold War by Francis Stoner Saunders. And here Saunders is discussing the development of the CIA. Quote, "The CIA took its character from its wartime predecessor, the Office of Strategic Services, or OSS. Columnist Drew Pearson called it, quote, one of the fanciest groups of dilettante diplomats, Wall Street bankers, and amateur detectives ever seen in Washington. Recruiting from the heart of America's corporate, political, academic, and cultural establishment, Donovan, the individual responsible for recruiting, had assembled an elite corps which had hailed from America's most powerful institutions and families. Members of the Mellon family held espionage posts in Madrid, London, Geneva, Paris. J.P. Morgan's sons were both in the OSS. The families Vanderbilt, DuPont, Archbold of Standard Oil, Ryan of Equitable Life Insurance, Wheel of Macy's Department Store, Whitney, were all represented in the ranks of the secret army. It was this historic elite, the Ivy Leaguers, who cast their influence over America's boardrooms, academic institutions, major newspapers and media, law firms, and government, who now step forward to fill the ranks of the fledgling agency." End quote. So just to make an immediate connection, the original composition of the CIA, right? Wall Street bankers, members of the wealthiest families in the world, and elite members of academia and media institutions are exactly the kind of people who Epstein liaised with. And these were the exact kind of people who felt at the turn of the 20th century that it was their ordained duty to stop the spread of communism in Europe after World War II. Now, perhaps the most effective methods that the CIA used as part of the Marshall Plan also happen to be the most insidious and least well known. And these methods not only had tremendous success in thwarting the rise of workers' movements around the world, but they've also had and continue to have tremendous success in indoctrinating generations of people against communism, particularly in the United States and Europe. What Saunders details in her book is a deeply intentional and well thought out plan on the part of the elite to coerce people through a kind of subliminal cultural messaging. What these elites knew is that if they were going to cajole people into being sympathetic with the United States and its values, they would first have to reverse this popular European perception of the United States as being devoid of culture, as being hyper-materialist, etc. And so the CIA teamed up with some of the United States' most prominent artists, playwrights, intellectuals, novelists, you name it. And they used the endless funds of the Marshall Plan to promote the works of these artists and essentially disseminate them throughout Europe and the Soviet Union. And not only did they have a direct hand in promoting the works, but they were also critically involved in publishing literature, covertly producing and distributing over 10 million books and magazines infused with anti-communism and so-called Western ideas of intellectual freedom. And of course, nothing spells intellectual freedom quite like a covert CIA program designed to brainwash millions of people. Now, the names of the artists that the CIA used might surprise you, and they also speak to the underlying message of this episode, which I'll make even more clear in just a moment. But Jackson Pollock, the famous abstract expressionist painter, jazz legends Louis Armstrong, Dizzy Gillespie, renowned authors like Albert Camus, just to name a few, it was the works of people like this, and it should be said sometimes without their direct knowledge, that the CIA was promoting and publishing. And perhaps the most surprising name of all is George Orwell. That's right, the author of seemingly some of the most radical, socially critical books of all time, 1984, Animal Farm, was effectively a CIA asset. And if we want to understand why the elite class in the United States had no issues encouraging the popularity of books that criticize the elite class, we have to understand a concept known as non-communist leftism, which is to say any type of leftism, any type of anti-capitalism that's not communist. And this is a term straight out of the CIA's Marshall Plan playbook. You see, what the CIA figured out is if it was going to convince people that the United States and capitalism were the way forward for humanity, it would have to at least create the illusion of freedom of thought, and therefore the perceived ability within these systems to be critical of the systems. Almost as if to say, look how free we are in the United States, right? You can criticize your government, you can criticize the forces of power, you can even be an anti capitalist, right? You can be a leftist as long as you're not a communist. Right? And so the CIA, the elite class, was willing to ally itself with non communist leftism because at the end of the day, any type of leftism that's not communist doesn't actually represent a threat to the elite class. The only political and economic ideology that actually represents a threat to the elite class, to the Epstein class, if you will, the only one that can actually subvert a capitalist world order is communism and the framework of analysis provided therein, which is exactly why they're so afraid of it and why many of us have also internalized that fear. Okay, so how is all of this related to the Epstein files? Well, as I alluded to earlier, everyone that Epstein was close to was and continues to be an avowed anti communist. And Epstein maintained close contact with anti communists of all varieties, including the anti capitalist variety. And when you think about who is perhaps the most famous US American anti capitalist academic of all time, Noam Chomsky is certainly a name that comes to mind. And of course, Noam Chomsky appears in the Epstein files several times, with his wife even indicating that Epstein is their quote best friend while inviting him to Noam's surprise birthday party back in 2018. And if the best friend comment didn't already give it away, this was not a one off occurrence, right? Chomsky and Epstein hung out together quite frequently. And this has led to a lot of confusion, particularly for many leftists in the United States. How could someone seemingly so critical of capitalism, so principled as Noam Chomsky, be at the heart of one of the most depraved expressions of capitalism that one could imagine? But when we have this context, this history, the willingness of the ruling class to collude and cooperate with non communist leftists, it becomes a little bit more clear. From the perspective of the elite class, it's actually beneficial to have what's called a kind of controlled opposition, almost like a fake opposition, or at least a non threatening one, that maintains this illusion of competing ideas and intellectual freedom and democracy. But the whole time, people are effectively being tricked into hating the only ideology that can break them out of the system that's ruled by these sadistic, genocidal pedophiles. Think of someone like Noam Chomsky almost as a prop, if you will, in society. He's the ultimate symbol of intellectual freedom. He's an anarchist or an anarcho syndicalist, someone who's supposedly so against the system that he advocates for its abolition. But by not crossing over into communism, he does so only within the bounds of the acceptable spectrum of debate as defined by the elites. And no one understands this, ironically, better than Noam Chomsky himself. And here's Chomsky in Manufacturing Consent discussing this phenomenon. Quote, "Debate cannot be stilled, and indeed in a properly functioning system of propaganda, it should not be, because it has a system reinforcing character if constrained within the proper bounds. What is essential is to set the bounds firmly. Controversy may rage as long as it adheres to the presuppositions that define the consensus of elites, and it should therefore be encouraged within these bounds, thus helping to establish these doctrines as the very condition of thinkable thought while reinforcing the belief that freedom reigns." End quote. So just to unpack that for a moment, the elites create the bounds of thinkable thought by setting parameters around what people are able to disagree on. And I think it's pretty clear at this point that communism is not within those parameters, right? The ruling class has decided for us what's acceptable to think, and what have they decided is most unacceptable to think? Communism. And this helps us explain why all of the elites that Epstein was liaising with are staunchly anti-communist. They don't want the only ideology that actually represents a threat to their hegemony, to their power, to their ability to do whatever they want without consequence or accountability, to become popular. They uniformly don't want communism to become popular. And so in conclusion, perhaps it would be a good idea then for people like us, who are not members of the elite, to stop hating the ideology that they also hate, and one which they've spent billions and billions of dollars training us to hate. Maybe it's time we create our own spectrum of thinkable thought, one with communism, Marxism, historical materialism, and the social sciences in general at the heart of it. Thank you very much for tuning in to Critical Consciousness today, y'all. If you like this video, please hit the like and subscribe button down below. I'll be back very soon with another episode. Take it easy.